grown rapidly across the African continent.
53 out of 54 African countries have a memorandum of understanding with China on the Belt and Road Initiative.
But China's current economic slowdown, coupled with the prospect of Western trade restrictions and the uncertainties posed by a new US administration, have prompted a recalibration of economic ties between China and
Chinese President Xi Jinping has just held talks with South African President Cyril Ramaphosa in Pretoria. Now, this is President Xi's fourth state visit to South Africa. During their meeting, Xi cited the long-standing and fruitful collaboration between the two nations over the years. He highlighted milestones such as the establishment of the Confucius Institute in Durban.
In a brilliant PR, public relations stunt, and marketing strategy, the Chinese communists are looking to leverage Donald Trump's tariff tiff with the world. What is that all about? Well, the Chinese communists have announced today, the 13th of June, 2025, that they will end all tariffs and all quota limitations for the 53 African countries which they have diplomatic relations will end. You can ship your goods and services to China without duty, no tariffs, and no quota.
What if I told you that while Washington was busy policing the world, a new empire was being built brick by brick without firing a single bullet? What if the greatest shift in global power didn't happen in a war room or at the United Nations, but on dusty African roads, inside silent ports, and deep beneath the soil of a continent the West dismissed for centuries? Because right now Africa and China are quietly flipping the global trade system upside down. This isn't aid, this isn't charity. This is strategy, power, and a historic reversal of 500 years of economic domination. From Lagos to Mombasa, from Addis Ababa to Johannesburg, Chinese-built railways are moving African minerals, crops, and tech products faster than ever straight into Asia, the Middle East, and Latin America, and bypassing the United States entirely. For the first time in modern history, African nations are no longer begging for a seat at the table. They're building their own table and inviting the world to sit with them on their terms. Western corporations are being kicked out of mines they controlled for decades. African ports are switching from dollars to yuan. New shipping routes are forming routes the US Navy doesn't control. And here's the twist no one saw coming. China didn't just partner with Africa, it helped Africa partner with itself. Suddenly, 1.4 billion Chinese and 1.4 billion Africans are creating a trade bloc so powerful it could rewrite global supply chains forever. The US thought it had time, it didn't. The world's reserves, rare earths, food security, lithium, gold, and future markets are realigning right now. This is not a prediction, it's already happening. And by the time the West wakes up, it might already be too late, because the global order is shifting, and this time, Africa is not the battlefield, Africa is the winner.
China is expanding its influence via economic means. This week, Beijing announced plans for a sweeping zero-tariff initiative for African exports. It is offering duty-free access to all 53 countries on the continent that maintain diplomatic ties with China. The announcement was made in a joint statement issued after a high-level meeting between China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi and African officials in the Chinese
plan for Africa, and let's just say it's going to change the entire future of the continent. China is now looking to Africa as the first location for its global payment system, as China seeks to expand its currency global use and break the dominance of the US dollar. This is massive news because just last month, China successfully recruited 53 African nations in a new trade framework that will see African exports enjoy 100% tariff-free access to the Chinese market.
Be billion in deficits with China. Think of it. Not even sustainable. But this is why we have $32 trillion in debt. When you think about it, much of it's owed to China, which is interesting. We'll have to work that out. I can see a nice swap there. You know, you've screwed us for about 30 years. Let's negotiate that debt. Let's renegotiate the debt. No, it's ridiculous. We owe them trillions of dollars, and they've taken advantage of us. I don't think that's good. Under Biden...
The shift began quietly, not with tanks or treaties, but with cargo ships. For decades, the world assumed the center of global trade would stay anchored in the Atlantic between Washington, London, Brussels, and New York. Yet beneath that complacency, a seismic shift was unfolding across the Indian Ocean, where African ports and Chinese factories were building an entirely new trade architecture, one that no Western think tank predicted. It was not just the movement of goods, it was the movement of power. Africa, once treated as a supplier of raw materials and a dumping ground for finished products, suddenly became a central node in a new trade order. And China? It became the system's engine, designing logistics, financing infrastructure, and rewriting the rules of commerce in real time. The transformation began when a handful of African nations joined forces to form a continental export strategy. They no longer sent in processed cocoa, lithium, or crude oil to Europe and America. Instead, new refineries and manufacturing hubs emerged, built with Chinese capital, operated with African expertise, and protected by cooperative military agreements. Goods that used to be shipped out unfinished now stayed, were processed, packaged, branded, and exported not just to China, but across Asia, the Middle East, Latin America, and eventually even back to Europe. It was the ultimate reversal of colonial economics. Instead of exporting value, Africa was recapturing it. China saw what the West ignored: 1.4 billion people in Africa rising into consumer power, digital adoption, and urban expansion. Instead of dictating terms, Beijing offered railways for copper, industrial zones for tax incentives, and its own currency for trade settlements. Africa didn't reject the dollar, it simply stopped depending on it, with the yuan and several African currencies now clearing international transactions through central bank digital systems. The old SWIFT monopoly weakened. Western economists laughed at the idea of Africa and China reshaping global trade until the numbers came in, and the balance of power shifted. What shook Washington wasn't just trade, it was the speed. Africa and China started connecting economies faster than any IMF program or NATO partnership ever had. In just a few years, Kenya was exporting electric vehicles assembled with Chinese components. Nigeria was shipping processed gas directly to Asia instead of waiting for European contracts. South Africa was running one of the world's largest green hydrogen corridors, backed by Chinese engineers. A new maritime route, Beira to Shenzhen, became so profitable that Asian shipping companies abandoned U.S. routes entirely. Suddenly, African ports became more valuable than several European ones combined. For the first time in modern history, Africa was no longer positioned between world powers, it was one of the world powers. The West tried to push back through media narratives and diplomatic pressure. They accused Africa of debt dependency, corruption, and selling out. But the continent remembered the loans that never built roads, the aid that came with conditions, and the decades of economic sabotage disguised as advice. The West had centuries to help build Africa. It chose extraction instead. China understood this resentment and leveraged it with precision. The Belt and Road Initiative evolved into the Belt, Road and Market Alliance, tying African industrialization to Chinese logistics and digital payment systems while avoiding the colonial language of development. Meanwhile, Washington watched foreign investment leave its shores faster than it anticipated. American corporations began shifting factories to Africa not for cheap labor, but to access new trade lanes free from sanctions, tariffs, and dollar restrictions. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce warned that if the trend continued, America would lose its position as the world's primary trade broker. But by the time the warning was issued, the shift was already irreversible. Trade maps began to change. Atlantic routes shrank. Indian Ocean and Pacific routes expanded. African aviation hubs saw record traffic as new airlines emerged, supported by Chinese aerospace technology and investment. Countries like Ethiopia, Angola, and Tanzania became logistics superpowers, linking Latin America, Asia, and the Gulf. The trade triangle that once stretched across New York, London, Berlin was being replaced by Johannesburg, Shanghai, Dubai. And then came the moment that terrified Washington the most. African and Chinese leaders jointly announced a multilateral digital trade currency. Not a crypto token, not a Western blockchain, but a regulated government-backed payment system that allowed intercontinental trade without touching a single U.S. bank. With that announcement, the dollar's dominance began to crack, not collapse, but weaken like a dam holding too much pressure. This wasn't just geopolitics, it was structural change, generational change, a rewrite of how the world moves and profits. The U.S. thought its influence was permanent because it had never imagined a world where Africa and China acted as equal partners. Instead of charity, there was partnership. Instead of extraction, there was co-investment. Western monopoly was dissolving not through war, but through the quiet, consistent logic of trade. The irony. While American politicians warned about China taking over Africa, it was actually Africa taking control of its own resources with China as the accelerant. For the first time, African leaders were shaping global rules instead of obeying them. They had leverage, options, alliances, and most importantly, alternatives. The world had shifted. Trade had shifted. Power had shifted. And Washington was left watching, not leading, because the future wasn't being negotiated in the White House anymore. It was being exported from Mombasa, financed in Beijing, traded in digital currency, and protected by alliances that didn't need Western approval. The US didn't just fail to see the shift, it never believed such a shift was even possible. But history has a sense of humor, especially when the underestimated finally rise. The global trade order had been rewritten, and this time Africa was not just in the story, it was writing it. The second phase of the global shift began not in boardrooms or presidential palaces, but in the fields, mines, railways, and ports where African economies were transforming in real time. What had started as a new trade alignment now evolved into a strategic takeover of global supply chains. The old narrative was gone. Africa was no longer a passive exporter feeding Western industries, it was now the world's most important resource hub, value chain manager, and geoeconomic gatekeeper. And China, with all its precision and long-term planning, had positioned itself as Africa's closest strategic partner. The West had always assumed that influence flowed from military power and financial pressure. But China understood something different. In the 21st century, influence comes from infrastructure, logistics, manufacturing, and data. Whoever controlled these controlled the future, and Africa, with the world's youngest population and largest reserves of strategic resources, was the last major arena still up for grabs. So the shift escalated. China didn't just build roads, it built transport corridors that connected landlocked mineral belts to global shipping routes. It didn't just finance railways, it linked them to its own freight networks that stretched all the way to Asia. It didn't just open factories, it trained entire African workforces to operate and eventually own them. Trade wasn't transactional, it was strategic. Every port built served as a supply chain node. Every fiber cable laid became a digital artery. Every industrial-free zone became a magnet for manufacturing that used to happen in the United States and European Union. Washington watched with mounting disbelief industries that once made the United States wealthy. Steel, electronics, fertilizer, textiles were now being rebuilt on African soil with Chinese machinery, African labor, and non-dollar trade settlements. If the first stage was about shifting exports, this stage was about shifting production. The tipping point came when major global corporations made a choice that Washington never expected. They moved out of the US market and into Africa. Not because labor was cheap, but because growth was inevitable. Africa's middle class was expanding faster than any region on Earth. Its urbanization rate was unmatched. Its digital adoption was explosive. And with China providing both the infrastructure and the financing, companies realized it was smarter to produce inside African markets than to export to them. That was when the US government launched its counteroffensive, sanctions, warnings, congressional hearings, think tank reports accusing Africa of falling into the new Sino-colonial trap. But the narrative no longer worked. Africa had choices now, partnerships now, leverage now. The colonial language of development aid sounded outdated when compared to equity investment, technology transfer, and industrial partnership. Even European trade officials were forced to admit privately that the West had made a massive mistake. They treated Africa like a charity case, while China treated it like a global partner. They offered lectures. China offered airports. They sent advisors. China sent engineers. They promised democracy while blocking market access. China promised access and let countries decide their own politics. And beneath the diplomatic tensions, something even more dangerous was forming, a new global trade bloc. African states began coordinating their export standards, tariffs, and digital regulations with China. Not Europe or the US. Africa now had a continental free trade zone bigger than the EU itself, backed by Chinese logistics and supply chain intelligence. The West had built alliances through military bases. China built them through shipping lanes, finance, and broadband. The real shock came when African nations began setting terms for resource extraction. European mining giants that once dictated prices were suddenly forced to negotiate with African governments that demanded processing, job guarantees, and local ownership. China built refineries and smelters on African territory, eliminating the need for exports of raw minerals to Europe, instead of shipping cobalt or to France or Belgium. The cobalt was turned into battery components inside Africa and exported to Asia. Value stayed where the resources came from. This was the economic reversal the West never expected. Then came the currency moment, more impactful than any weapon, sanction, or speech. Africa and China announced they were settling all trade through digital payments using the yuan and localized African currencies. No SWIFT, no Federal Reserve intermediaries, no dollar pegs. The international financial system trembled. Wall Street analysts warned that if the trend continued, demand for the dollar would weaken and U.S. borrowing would become unsustainable. The U.S. national debt machine depended on dollar supremacy. But if global trade stopped using it, the entire system would wobble. That was when Washington finally realized the truth. This wasn't just about trade, it was about control. It was about who sets the rules. And for the first time in a century, the answer was no longer the United States. Africa and China were now building a system parallel to the Western one, but faster, cheaper, and without ideological strings. They were creating a world where access to capital didn't require IMF reforms, where infrastructure didn't require austerity, where sovereignty wasn't conditional. The West called it dangerous, Africa called it overdue. Even global institutions began to shift. The World Bank and IMF lost influence as African nations turned to Chinese banks, BRICS institutions, and new Africa-based sovereign wealth networks. Ratings agencies that once held African economies hostage suddenly became irrelevant when African governments no longer needed approval to access financing. The transactional era of Western dominance was giving way to a multipolar structure, and Africa was at the center of it. The geopolitical consequences spread fast. European factories faced material shortages as African minerals were redirected to Asia. The U.S. agricultural sector lost key buyers when African states built self-sufficient food networks powered by Chinese irrigation technology. Even tech companies struggled when Africa switched to Chinese cloud systems and stopped relying on American data centers. This wasn't isolation, it was liberation. And once Africa tasted independence at scale, there was no going back. The United States tried everything: summits, charm offensives, diplomatic pressure, military partnerships, but the truth was impossible to unsee. Africa was finally building for itself. China accelerated it, but Africa owned it. What the US couldn't understand was that this shift wasn't anti-West, it was post-West. A new chapter where power didn't come from Washington consensus, but from Nairobi-Beijing cooperation. The world order was being rewritten, not with war, not with ideology, but with trade routes, ports, digital currency, steel mills, and confidence, and the shift had only just begun. The third phase of the transformation was the most disruptive, not because of economics alone, but because of perception. The psychological shift that once seemed impossible had finally taken root. Africa was no longer seen as a passive recipient of global power, but as an architect of it, and that realization terrified the Western establishment more than any trade deal or infrastructure project ever could. The change didn't begin in parliaments, it began in ports, data hubs, and stock exchanges. African nations now negotiated contracts as equal stakeholders, not desperate borrowers. They rejected extractive deals, demanded value sharing, and built new revenue models powered by technology and industrialization. China's involvement did not create a dependency, it enabled a reset. And now African governments were using that foundation to rewrite the global rules. One of the major turning points came when Africa and China launched a unified digital trade framework that bypassed Western banking systems entirely. A continent-wide digital payment network operating through blockchain-secured, currency-neutral settlements allowed African exporters to transact instantly across borders without touching the US dollar or European clearing systems. The significance was historic. Africa and China had just built a financial system the West could not shut down, sanction, or control. From that moment, everything accelerated. Raw materials stopped leaving the continent unprocessed. Instead of shipping crude oil, African nations partnered with Chinese engineering firms to build modular refineries and petrochemical hubs. Copper was no longer exported as scraps, it became cables, electrical components, and renewable energy infrastructure produced in African factories. Lithium produced battery storage systems. Cobalt became electric car components. Thousands of jobs were created not abroad but at home. The effect on Western industries was catastrophic. Companies that relied on cheap African resources suddenly found that the supply chain had moved upstream, controlled from Nairobi, Lusaka, Luanda, and Beijing, not London or Washington. European manufacturers panicked as input costs surged and supply routes shifted east. American industries, already weakened by debt and declining domestic production, struggled to adapt. Yet while Western media labeled the shift a hostile takeover, African leaders framed it as long overdue justice. For centuries, the continent supplied the world while remaining poor. Now it was capturing value, owning production, and controlling trade routes. Critics called it Chinese influence. Africans called it economic sovereignty. Meanwhile, China watched patiently as its long-term strategy flourished. While the West chased short-term profits and political cycles, China had invested steadily in relationships, infrastructure, and self-reinforcing systems. It had created something far more powerful than influence. It had created interdependence. Africa now exported to China, manufactured with China, trained engineers in China, and settled trade through Chinese banks and platforms. Nothing the West could offer was comparable in scale or reliability, but Africa was not blindly following Beijing. It was using the partnership as leverage. For the first time, African countries had real bargaining power. They could negotiate better terms with Europe. They could reject IMF loan conditions without fear. They could dictate export bans on unprocessed resources. And every time Africa took a firm stance, China backed it because African strength strengthened China's global position. The West soon realized it was no longer dealing with isolated nations. It was facing a coordinated economic bloc. African trade ministers spoke with one voice. African central banks coordinated digital currency and monetary policies. Africa built satellites beamed secure communication across borders, bypassing Western telecom giants, and every policy was increasingly designed to serve African interests first. At the same time, cultural power began shifting. African universities partnered with Chinese institutions to develop their own research hubs. African streaming platforms and film industries gained international reach with access to Chinese capital and distribution. Even global tourism began changing. Millions of Chinese travelers chose African destinations over Western ones, bringing revenue that bypassed the traditional tourism monopolies. This evolution changed global geopolitics in ways the West could no longer predict or control. Security alliances that once defined Africa's position in the world began to crumble as nations built military and cyber defense partnerships with emerging powers. Intelligence sharing networks bypassed NATO, drone programs used Chinese systems, satellite surveillance no longer needed Western approval. Africa was not anyone's battleground. It was becoming an autonomous power center. The breaking point for the United States finally came when global financial markets began adopting African minerals-backed digital currencies as stable trade instruments, especially for energy and tech manufacturing. Investors, corporations, and even states began using them as alternatives to the dollar for commodity settlements. The U.S. couldn't weaponize the dollar against what it no longer controlled. Sanctions, once the strongest tool in Washington's arsenal, became less effective. It was then that American analysts admitted what African thinkers had long known. Power had shifted not because Africa wanted revenge, but because Africa had options. It had partners. It had leverage. The global hierarchy had finally been disrupted. By now, the U.S. was in full damage control mode, launching rapid policy changes, sending diplomats across the continent, proposing joint ventures, and offering delayed infrastructure investment. But the tone had changed. There was no more commanding, only pleading. Even former allies responded with quiet firmness. The world had moved on. The most symbolic moment happened quietly but echoed loudly across global politics when African trade leaders publicly declared that the era of aid dependence was over. No more paternalistic lectures, no more handouts disguised as control. The continent was now a partner, investor, and competitor, and in that moment, the world realized something profound. Africa didn't become powerful because China gave it power. Africa became powerful because it finally stopped asking permission. The West could no longer define Africa's future. Africa was defining its own, with China or without it, and for the first time in modern history, the global system was forced to adjust to an Africa that was not begging, not waiting, not apologizing, but leading.